All right, everybody, let's get to it. Whether you're drinking soda, pop, or Kirkland's delicious sparkling water, I choose lemon flavor because it's so refreshing. Whatever you're drinking, join us in Classics 160D2, Classical Mythology, and today's lecture 12.2 on Iphigenia as historical commentary. How we have this character from Greek mythology, but in the stories that they tell, they're also kind of commenting on the real kind of life situation of what's going on in ancient Greece. So we will hear a little bit about that today. Let's see what we got on the docket. All right, so announcements and recap by yours truly. Then Katie is going to tell us about who Iphigenia is. Julianne will take us through the first of the plays about Iphigenia, Iphigenia and Aulis. And then Darcy will talk about the other one, the one that you had a reading for today, Iphigenia among the Taurians. Again, you didn't have anything due in terms of like a reading response for that, but the reading was up there for this week. And then what we'll do is we'll conclude today with a little talk of the Peloponnesian War, because some scholars have seen the story of Iphigenia as essentially an allegory for the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. And then Matt will conclude today by taking us through the war itself. So that's the plan. Let's see what we got on the docket in terms of announcements. You guys know most of them. Go ahead and put it in speaker view. You can see me. You can see the words, the wonderful images that we bring to you today. If you have any questions, go ahead and try to send those to somebody who is not speaking at the time, because I'm a terrible multitasker and I get super distracted. A couple fun announcements. So next Friday is the very, very last of your weekly reading responses, all right? Yay! Yay! So you're almost done with those, all right? We're going into the wonderful world of Roman mythology next week, so you'll be reading a little bit about the early days of Rome. And you get that done, and your kind of writing assignments for the semester are over. And then also, in other exciting news, we do have class all of next week. Next week's a normal week. But for Thanksgiving, we're not, like the week of Thanksgiving, we're not doing these kind of live classes, all right? So you're going to be watching a movie, the 1963 version of Jason and the Argonauts. It's going to be on D2L. You can watch it whenever you want. I do expect that you watch it at some point in time over the break. But you can do that at your leisure. You don't need to worry about attendance or anything like that. So, good, exciting announcements there. Extra credit, if you did meet with either Think Tank or the Writing Skills Improvement Program for your research proposals, go ahead and send the confirmation of those or the summary of those to your TA. That'll actually work better than trying to get the tutor to send the email. Talked about this on Monday, but just go ahead and do that. And we'll make sure to enter your extra credit. Let's see, what else? Moving forward, the final kind of, well, you got two big, all right, you've got three things from here on out, right? You've got your final reading response for next week, all right? That's standard. You've been doing a bunch of them. Hopefully you guys got those things down pat now. And then looking forward past Thanksgiving, you've got your final project due, I believe it's the Friday after Thanksgiving. I got to check that, but I think it's the Friday after Thanksgiving. So you got a couple weeks, but right now you guys should start moving and taking all the great research you've done for this proposal and starting to transform it into whatever the kind of final product is, right? Whether it's a movie or a documentary or a music video or a graphic novel or a computer game. Whatever you're doing for your final project, start working on that now. You got about 3 weeks until that thing's due. But that's worth a significant portion of your grade. You should have done a lot of the research already. So really what you're doing over the last few weeks is just transforming that research into a format that's going to be engaging for a broad group of people while still showing that you've done a lot of research and really dug into the primary sources. Okay. And then there's the final exam. The way the final is going to work is on the last day of class. It's only like an hour long. The question is always like, is it about the entire semester or is it just the second half of the semester? I don't even remember. I don't know. What? We'll say the second half of the semester. Okay? We'll just do the second half of the semester. Except for, I don't know. I clearly have to think more about the final exam. Here's the basic thing, all right? Multiple choice questions will just be the second half of the semester. You're going to have, I think, 2 essay questions on it. At least one of those is going to ask you to kind of build linkages between like the first half of the semester and the second half. That'll kind of be the synthetic thing. The essay question or questions will be similar to what you had on the first one in the sense that there are many different ways to create a correct answer. It's really about the creativity of it and your ability to argue and provide evidence to support it. We'll talk more about this, how about next week? It looks like the study abroad in Italy is moving forward. So if you're like, well, especially after next week when we start talking about Roman mythology, if you're like, gotta get to Italy, we'll see Greek temples there, we'll see Roman temples, we'll see the Colosseum, everything. This is run by a couple of people in the town of Orvieto, which is just the most charming place in all of Italy. But we'll talk more about that if you're interested. Certainly feel free to shoot me an email and I can point you in the right direction there. It is the best. All right, so quick recap. I will do this in 1 minute or as many minutes as it takes. TAs, when you guys become professors, you got to do this to your TAs as well, where like you give them a certain amount of time and then you just talk for as long as you want. But okay, back to female heroines, right? What we talked about is that we don't have a lot of like kind of traditional hero style heroines in the sense that women are in large part confined to the house. When they get out, it's go to the market or the temple or the water fountain, right? They're not sailing the 7 seas, going to exotic locales, fighting in military campaigns, the traditional stuff that makes heroes in ancient Greece. As a result, what we've been talking about this week is that in many ways, female heroines are similar to actual like real life historical heroes in Greece, right? We talked about several different levels from like ranging from the totally mythological to actual for real people who get commemorated as heroes because of the things they do in life. And in particular, we looked at these 2 guys, right? Harmodius and Aristogeiton, known as the Tyrannicides or the tyrant slayers, who ended up trying to take out the last 2 tyrants in Athens. We saw they were only mildly successful, but nonetheless, they were commemorated in generations to come with statues put up in the Agora, songs praising them for securing equal rights amongst citizens. They were given sacrifices after their death, and then their descendants were dined at the public expense and exempt from taxes. I really wish that my ancestors had done something so awesome that I could be exempt from taxes, but they didn't, so I have to pay taxes. And I don't know, that's life. Taxes. Anyway, let's move on. That's it. That's all I got today. Katie, the stage is yours. Go ahead and take over. Tell us about Iphigenia, and then we will start this awesome journey. Thank you.
All right, I guess I will share the screens. Oh, Darcy sharing the screen. All right, excellent. So just to begin with, we're going to talk a little bit about who Iphigenia is, just in the scope of the mythological tradition. So if you all recall our talk about the curse on the house of Atreus and that entire disastrous situation, Iphigenia is part of that family. So they started with Tantalus, and then he screwed up and tried to feed his kid to the gods, and then he got cursed because of that, and then his son screwed up and he also got cursed. And just every generation has a series of extremely terrible events happening to them. And Iphigenia is no different. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the sacrifice, just because I know that we will be talking about that with the play Iphigenia and Aulis, but just on a very broad, just for very broad discussion of what's happening there. Agamemnon screws up, as Agamemnon often does, and he hunts this deer that's sacred to Artemis. And he doesn't apologize. He doesn't get her permission to do this. And so she gets very mad and she's like, you guys don't get any wind. And so you can't sail to Troy. And this entire journey was completely pointless. And this essentially leads to Iphigenia having to be sacrificed to the gods. And in some variations of the story, she ends up surviving because Artemis whisks her away. If you look at the top picture on the right here, that's one of the versions of Iphigenia surviving. And that is what we're going to be going over in our play discussions. For those of you who haven't watched Game of Thrones, this is a spoiler, so I'm sorry. But it's been out a while, so I'm not that sorry. For those of you who have watched Game of Thrones, you might remember the sacrifice of Shireen Baratheon, which basically follows the sacrifice of Iphigenia story exactly. So we have troops who they're stuck in a location, they can't get where they need to go. And the commander of these troops has to sacrifice his own daughter to like turn the fates in their favor. We have a mother who is super not on board with this entire situation, and also a second in command who can't do anything about it. So with no further ado, let's move on to Iphigenia and Aulis.
Yes, okay. So Iphigenia and Aulis predates the next play that we're going to look at least chronologically, but it was actually written last by Euripides. So Euripides wrote both Iphigenia, oh my gosh, I can say English words, it's fine, and Aulis, and the next play that she's going to talk about here a little bit, but it was written between 408 and 406 CE, and we have that end date of 406 because that's when Euripides is believed to have died. But like Katie says, this play really does discuss Iphigenia's sacrifice and Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia. It's fine. So the play starts with Agamemnon, and he has already sent word to Clytemnestra to send Iphigenia on so that way she can marry Achilles. He says, feel free to pronounce the name however you want. Ah, perfect. Wonderful. I mispronounce many things in my life, so I'm always glad to get permission. Agamemnon has told Clytemnestra to send Iphigenia on so that way she can marry Achilles before they sail off. But this is all a ruse because in reality, Agamemnon wants to sacrifice her to Artemis because they haven't been getting the winds that they need so that way they can sail off and the army can go fight. But Agamemnon, the play starts and he's already sent the letter, but he is doubting his decision. And so he sends a second letter that's like, wait, no, actually don't send Iphigenia, keep her there. But this letter is intercepted by Menelaus, who takes this as personal offense because the whole reason they were going off to fight was because, remember, his wife, Helen, was the one that was taken away. So the play starts and you have Agamemnon and Menelaus, and they're kind of arguing about this. So they have this discussion, and they each actually end up persuading the other to their opinion. So Menelaus convinces Agamemnon that he should sacrifice Iphigenia, and Agamemnon ends up convincing Menelaus that Iphigenia, I'm so sorry, should not be sacrificed. So they end up convincing each other of what they were originally thinking, but all that means is that Agamemnon is set, that he is going to sacrifice Iphigenia. So she arrives, and like I said, she thinks that she's marrying the great hero Achilles, and Achilles thinks that he is marrying Iphigenia, but then they found out that it's all a ruse and she's actually getting sacrificed. So Achilles is upset, primarily that he was used as a pawn by Agamemnon. Iphigenia is upset because she's going to be sacrificed, and her mom's upset because her daughter's getting sacrificed. So a bunch of people are mad. No one's super happy about this, but Achilles vows that he will stop this. He takes Iphigenia aside. This is more his own personal pride. He's upset that Agamemnon used him as a pawn. So it's not really that he's just like, oh, this is this poor defenseless girl who is going to be sacrificed, I should help her, but really like, how dare Agamemnon use me and not tell me what's going on. So he tries to rally the troops in support, but the troops are all like, nah, we kind of want to get fighting. Let's just sacrifice the girl and move on with it. So he gets no support there. So Achilles is ready to actually use physical force to stop the sacrifice. And Iphigenia sees that this is going to happen. Oh, and Iphigenia and Clytemnestra first try and convince Agamemnon not to do it, but he's kind of set in his way. He's like, this is the only option we have. We need to get off fighting. We need the wins. We have to sacrifice you. So he's not going to change his mind. So Achilles is ready to use force. This is where Iphigenia steps in, and she's like, no, you shouldn't use force for this. Like, don't fight and kill because of me. I will just go to my death. You can sacrifice me, so that way you get the wins. And it is portrayed as this more heroic death. She is willing to sacrifice herself, so that way the troops can appease Artemis, and the troops can go off and fight. And so she goes off to her sacrifice, and she leads the chorus in a hymn to Artemis. And so you do have this scene of a heroic death. And then or not, because then it said that she was replaced by a deer at the altar. And this is included in some of the manuscripts, but there is some debate amongst scholars as to whether that's actually original to Euripides' play or whether that was a later interpolation, maybe while scribes were copying. And when Darcy here takes over, you can see why scribes might have later added that is because Iphigenia being replaced by a deer at the altar is something that does become frequent within the canon. And you also have in some of the manuscripts that Artemis herself comforts Clytemnestra and is like, no, it's okay, she didn't die. But again, there's some contention amongst scholars as to whether that was original within Euripides' play or not. So this is kind of what happens with the sacrifice as described in Iphigenia. I swear I know English words. Iphigenia and Aulis. I'll let Darcy take over from here, and hopefully she can actually pronounce words. It'll be good.
I'm not so sure, but I guess we'll see. So Iphigenia among the Taurians. Was that right? Iphigenia? We'll just roll with it. So Iphigenia, like Julian said, it was written in 413 BC. So it was, even though it was written before Iphigenia Aulis, it's about something that happens after the sacrifice, after that whole story. So broad overview, it's about, it's a tragedy where Iphigenia and her brother Orestes meet in Taurus well after the whole sacrifice and all that deal.
So in this video,
and Taurus is a location that is kind of at the edge of the Greek world. It's way over on the Black Sea in what's now the Crimean Peninsula. This is the same region that Medea is from. So to the Greek world, this is kind of just like shorthand for something that's very foreign, unfamiliar, kind of barbaric. And they kind of had the sense that it's just very strange, a little bit dangerous, and we'll kind of see how that comes in. So obviously we already talked a bit about the sacrifice. So in this one for sure, even though Agamemnon thought that he was sacrificing his daughter, at the last minute, Artemis swoops in and changes Iphigenia with a deer, exchanges them. So Agamemnon thinks that he's sacrificing his daughter, but he ends up just sacrificing this deer, but thinks the whole time that it was just Iphigenia. So after this, Artemis takes Iphigenia off to Taurus, and she becomes the priestess at the Temple of Artemis there. And this is cool. I mean, I guess it's better than being sacrificed, but the big problem is that the Taurians have this really strange habit where if strangers come into their territory, then they sacrifice them to the goddess Artemis. And so, of course, Iphigenia, as the priestess of Artemis there at this temple, is the one responsible for performing these sacrifices. So, I mean, she didn't get sacrificed, but she has to sacrifice people herself. I don't know, kind of a win-lose, I guess. So anyways, she's doing all these sacrifices. Life isn't great, but she's still alive. But to make matters a little bit worse, she has this dream, and she interprets this dream to mean that her brother has been killed. So that's kind of the end of her family line, and she's really sad about it. So this is kind of the events that are happening when something kind of unexpected happens. So Orestes, who is not actually dead, Iphigenia's brother Orestes, has to fulfill this one last quest to kind of purify this injustice that he did when he killed his mother. So he has to go to Taurus and steal the statue of Artemis there and then take it back to Greece. So Orestes goes to Taurus with his friend Pylades, who has been accompanying him on all of his adventures. And they, of course, get caught. But Iphigenia figures out that they're Greeks, so she decides that she's only going to sacrifice one of them, and then she's going to send the other one back to Greece with a message telling her family that she's not really dead. So Orestes, because he's noble and kind of got them into this whole situation in the first place, he insists that Pylades be the one to live. So Iphigenia gives Pylades the letter. And she also, just in case he happens to lose the letter or, you know, something unexpected happens, tells him the contents of this entire letter. So through this, of course, the brother and sister learn who each other are, and they have a nice little reunion. So let me see. They're still kind of on the hook, or Iphigenia is still kind of on the hook to sacrifice somebody, but instead, the three of them make this plan to sort of trick the Taurians. So they tell them that Orestes polluted the statue of Artemis. So the Greeks kind of had this idea that, you know, if you do something morally reprehensible, you kind of carry around this pollution. So they sort of use this to trick them into thinking that, you know, the statue itself is now tainted, and they have to take it and wash it in the sea. So this is what Orestes is going to do. He's going to take the statue and wash it in the sea. But instead, Orestes, Iphigenia, and Pylades board their ship, and they start heading back to the Peloponnese. And everything's great, right? Except the winds start pushing them back to Taurus. So it sort of looks like they're going to get recaptured, and probably everybody's going to be killed in the whole deal. But luckily, Athena steps in. And this sort of happens with Euripides sometimes. You have this god that swoops in when, you know, at the 11th hour, when it looks like everything's going to just go terribly wrong. And she kind of rectifies the situation and makes everything right. And so that's exactly what we're seeing here. Athena convinces the king to let them go. So they take their statue back and they set up a temple to Artemis, where Iphigenia continues to be the priestess. But luckily, she doesn't have to sacrifice any more Greeks along the way. So that's kind of the story about Iphigenia among the Taurians. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about the Peloponnesian War. I think Colin's going to talk to us a bit about that. So let's go ahead and see what he's got to say.
Alrighty, hi everybody. So my section is brought to you by Starbucks. So we're going to be talking about Thucydides, one of the ancient Greece's and Western literature's foremost famous historians. All right, so who was Thucydides? And like, why are we talking about him before we get to the Peloponnesian War? So he was an Athenian general, actually during the Peloponnesian War from about 431, which lasted 431-404 BCE. And he actually did a really good job, except that he got sick and then was a general in charge of this area called Amphipolis, and it kind of got destroyed, and his men died, and as a result, he back in Athens was exiled. So his military career was over. But that wasn't so much of a bad thing, because his family was very rich. They owned a lot of mines in what's called Thrace. So it's a bit north of Greece, where we think of Macedonia today. So what do you do when you are an exiled, rich, wealthy person? You write history. So think of Thucydides as someone in the 17th, 18th century who's going around Europe looking at all the grand monuments and documenting them. But instead, he decided that he was going to write about the Peloponnesian War, which he was when he was about like 3/4 of the way through, actually more than that. So it's a little bit incomplete, but Matt will tell you more about that. And what's really interesting is that Thucydides makes this difference of writing about historia versus archaeologica, or history versus archaeology. So history is going to be the systematic inquiry of whatever of the war and what's going on, versus the legends. So we can think about Thucydides taking these trips, meeting with the veterans of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans, the Athenians, and saying, hey, tell me your thoughts about this battle. What went on? I want to know. So he's going down, taking some notes, bringing all this research back to Thrace for his writings. Instead of saying, you know what, the gods just like had a bad day and that's why people were mad. He's looking at the human causes of the war, which is much different from what we were seeing in the Iliad or the Odyssey, or some of these other plays about historical myth, where bad things happen to people because the gods were mad. But in this case, people actually cause these problems. All right, let's go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about his work. So the history of the Peloponnesian War is written into 5 parts. And even though this is a 2-page primer, the Thucydides' work is fundamental for so many fields of inquiry that you may experience at UA, whether it's in philosophy, political science, history, classics. His reach really extends upon so many fields. So after he was exiled, he began writing the history as soon as possible. And he's known for writing about political realism. So political realism saying that, again, it's not the gods that are the cause of the war. It is actually the people who are the cause of the war. And different political ideologies are against one another. And so this has given rise to what came out of Harvard recently in the last 10 years is called the Thucydides trap, which might come up in some of your readings later. And this comes from the first line of his work, saying that the rise of Athens and then the fear of Sparta created this conflict. We can think of this in modern day terms, where we have the rise of China as a country that was considered, third world, but now very much first world, whereas the United States going up against another global powerhouse, these two countries could be growing into conflict with one another. And so the idea of the Thucydides trap is saying, don't try to fall for perception. You have to use diplomacy to talk this out. And so the last thing I'll talk to you about is the Athenian plague. And this is very apropos for what we're going through right now. And it's interesting to look at how people dealt with different kinds of plagues in history. The plague in this case wrecked Athens, killing about 25% or about 75,000 to 100,000 people of the population. It's thought that the plague was of typhus or potentially hemorrhagic fever. Hemorrhagic fever we've seen in type of disease like Ebola. Thucydides credits the plague with social morals of Athens have gone. And he's saying, don't blame the gods that this happened. So we could look at the Iliad when Apollo rained down a plague of arrows that caused all these mean, nasty, horrible things upon the Greeks. He's saying, no, there is something else going on here. I've seen this. He actually survived the plague, and he has these wonderful accounts of these pustules and like weird arcane words and descriptions that are kind of gross. But we know that the plague did exist, as mass graves have been found. Alrighty. So I'm going to pass the torch on to Matt, and he's going to tell you even more about the Peloponnesian War. But first, let's do our attendance. Hercules is looking really good with his club and skin in red. So go to quizzes and select red.
All right, so let's get started on the Peloponnesian Wars. Now, when we last left off our Greek city-states in history, they had just won against the Persians. The Persian king Xerxes I, and they won major victories at Salamis and Plataea and pushed them back. Now, this is kind of where the war mostly ended. There were some counterattacks into Persia along with Athens and its Delian League, waging wars against Persia and its allies, which eventually will bite them in the ass. So the Spartans and the Athens, they're finally friendly. All the city-states are kind of getting along until one day when Helots of Sparta, they revolt. And Sparta calls in its allies to help, and Athens comes in, and they're like, okay, yeah, we'll help. But Sparta was for some reason not happy with them and dismissed them and only them, and that just broke down any amenable relationships between the two. Now, before I go into the real thick of the Peloponnesian Wars, there's kind of two different versions. There's kind of two different wars. If you look up the Peloponnesian Wars on Google, what you're going to find is the second Peloponnesian War. That's going to be the first one you see, and it's just usually called the Peloponnesian Wars. And that's going to be between 431 and 404. But 15 years before that, and shortly after the Persian Wars, you have the first Peloponnesian War, 460, 445. So yeah, the Spartans and the Athens, their friendliness did not last long until they were at each other's throats again. And this is kind of building up. Athens and its naval power had, kind of like Colin said, had been building itself up over time. And Sparta achieving that kind of land power base in the Persian Wars. These two kind of heads of the areas came at each other. So the first Peloponnesian War, like I said, was it was kind of started when Sparta was like, Athens, get out of here. We don't want you. You're useless. And it mostly started out with Athens fighting Corinth. and some other allies of Sparta, especially on the Isthmus of Corinth. You can go to the next slide, by the way. Yeah, so they are mainly fighting kind of in the Isthmus of Corinth at first, especially the city of Megara. They're fighting over Megara, which is, if you look on the map, you see Corinth. And then if you go a little right and a little up, still on the Isthmus, you will see, right about there is where Megara is. And it's another major city on the Isthmus of Corinth. Controlling that is vital for controlling passageway through it. So at first it was kind of Athens that ended up taking Megara and controlling its major port, which is on the Gulf of Corinth. So now Athens kind of had control over the Saronic Gulf, the Corinthian Gulf, and a major naval power in the area. But Sparta eventually comes into action. Its ally, Doris, which is on the north shore of the Corinthian Gulf, it comes to aid it and wins a big battle. Then they are going to sail back. They sailed across from Achaia before, and they're going to sail back to the Peloponnesian to Sparta. But the Athenians decide to blockade them. And Sparta then decides to march back. On the way, they eventually go into a land battle with Athens and wipe the floor with them. So Athens takes a really big hit here, and Spartans march back to Sparta. But Athens, not wanting to stay down for long, eventually comes back. They defeat the Spartan ally, Thebes, and kind of take control of Boeotia. So, and the war from here kind of sort of like ends major engagements. What's mainly happening is that Athens, using its naval power base, is raiding the coasts of Sparta and the Peloponnese, destroying places like Githyon, major Spartan port. But while this is happening, as we mentioned before, Athens and its dealing league are fighting Persia. And they're in Egypt at the moment. And eventually that falls apart and they just get annihilated by the Persians. And so then they come back and they're not quite sure what to do. And they, again, kind of take some losses. So they take some losses and they suffer a big defeat in Thessaly, which is far northern Greece. And so they sue for peace. And this ends the First Peloponnesian War. Now, this peace was initially meant to last 5 years and then 30 years. And it lasts about 15 before they just hate each other enough. Go to the next slide. And this starts what I guess you could call the real Peloponnesian War. It's the big one. It's the one everybody thinks about. This is where you see Thucydides and mainly see Pericles and kind of the big battles of the Peloponnesian War. So you can kind of cut this one into three parts. You have the Archidamian War, which is what we're going to talk about now. And Archidamos was a king of Sparta. And his basic idea was, let's invade Attica and kind of siege the city and siege the area and kind of just like slowly cut away at Athens and also try to just break into the city. Now, I don't think it's on this slide. We'll have to see it later. But Athens had, and you can kind of see it on the map here around Athens. You have Athens and you have the port of Piraeus. And it had long walls that ran all the way to that city. So they were able to get supplies and ships in and out and not be surrounded by the Spartans. But when most people think of sieges, they think like, oh, this lasts like 4, 5, 6 months or even longer. They're occupying the city or the surrounding area and trying to starve them out. That's not how sieges worked in ancient Greece. Siege warfare was still really new, and you're not using the siege weaponry that you see in later eras, especially like the Romans. So what actually is happening, they're staying there for at the most about 3 weeks. They go to Athens, they go for about 3 weeks, and then they go back to Sparta. People have to go tend to their crops and be with the harvest and stuff. That's what the Spartan allies were doing. Sparta itself can't be away from Sparta long because the helots. So the Spartan slaves, who are mostly like Messenians, they would revolt from time to time, as you saw in the First Peloponnesian War. So the Spartans couldn't be away long, and they had to just go attack for a bit and then come back and make sure nothing was messed up. So this is kind of where you see the start of the Peloponnesian War, and this is kind of the path, the way. I'm trying to think the speed that the war develops at. Eventually, Athens sails around and lands at Pylos, which is in Messenia, and that's where that bottom arrow is going. And they win a major battle against Athens. They win a major battle against Sparta, and this kind of starts a new part of the war. Also during this time, we see the Athenian plague. Up until this moment, Athens had mainly been being kind of led by a man named Pericles, who is kind of one of the patrons of the Parthenon, and a very famous Athenian, wrote a lot of laws. But he ends up dying during this plague, which kind of shifted the momentum of Athens. Because before this, the Periclean strategy was to hold up in the city and kind of wait the Spartans out, because they could do it. They had the long walls. They could still get food and supplies in. There was even spaces for farms in the long walls. So they could supply themselves. But when he dies, the power shifts to a man called Creon. And he is kind of, well, what is kind of described as a war hawk. He's ready to go. He's ready to fight Sparta. At the same time, you have the rise of a Spartan similar called Brasidas. So basically, they start attacking each other. Creon wins the battle at Pylos. Brasidas goes to Amphipolis and wins and managed to take it. And that's where we see Thucydides kind of lose and get exiled. And then Creon and Brasidas meet again at Amphipolis and kill each other. And the war kind of shifts and takes a small break. You go to the next slide. So, you have another idea, which there's some colonies in Sicily, and they start to revolt at Syracuse, which is a Spartan ally, tries to start taking over the cities. Athens, like, we need to help. So they send originally Alcibiades over, and kind of mentioning the social kind of like degradation of morals. They don't like the Athenians don't really like Alcibiades, and they're trying to pull up some bogus charges about him like defacing or destroying some statues, and he ends up getting like recalled to be put on trial, but he defects to Sparta to kind of save himself. But Athens comes in and gets their ass kicked at Sicily. So that's kind of one of the big losses for Athens. This kind of marks the ending. And it kind of marks the downfall of Athens in this war. And Athens should have known, as people in Princess Bride do, never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Great movie, great book. All right, next slide. So kind of the end of the war. Athens suffers this big defeat at Sicily, and they are kind of wondering what to do. Their navy also suffers because they win a big battle, but they take some severe losses, and the Athenian, I guess, state, you should say, in a not so smart move and probably attempting to save its own face, ends up executing several of their most talented naval commanders because they thought, oh, you took too many losses, so you're useless. Which, one, demoralizes the Navy, which were usually pretty loyal to their commanders, and two, limits the ability of Athens. That's its strong suit, and when you take out its most famous commanders and its most powerful commanders, you're limiting what your Navy can do. Also, Sparta seeks aid from Darius II, the king of Persia, and he helps fund and supply a navy to Sparta. So eventually, Athens' navy is kind of destroyed, and Sparta ends up taking Athens. This kind of marks the end of the Peloponnesian War with the conquering of Athens. Now, a lot of Spartan allies wanted to just raise the city and be done with it. Sparta's like, no, they were some good friends. They were some good fighters. Yeah, we hate their guts, but let's not destroy the city. So what they do is they install tyrants in the city. What's called the 30 tyrants. That lasts a little bit. They're eventually thrown out. Athens becomes a democracy again. And eventually over time, in like the Corinthian War later on, Athens regains some of its power base, but not much. And this also kind of weakens Sparta as well. It took heavy losses. It's dealing with issues in the Peloponnese and trying to keep the Peloponnesian League together. And that kind of marks the end for really what we think of as kind of classical Greece, because at this point, and shortly afterwards, you have Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great come in and wipe the floor with most people, except Sparta. And funnily enough, my favorite quote ever was, even though the Spartans were weakened, Spartan was famous for a style of dialect called Laconic, which is based on the area of Laconia. It's kind of short and quick-witted. But Philip, wanting to kind of march into the Peloponnese, like, hey, if I attack Sparta, y'all are going to lose. Because even though Sparta had been weakened, he did not want to go to a battle because he knew the Spartans would kind of fight to the last man. And he would take heavy losses. But he's like, Philip sends a messenger, if I attack Sparta, the whole city will be destroyed. Spartans write back, if. And he actually never did. Philip never did attack Sparta, which is my favorite thing in the world. So yeah, Spartan spirit still lived on. So that's kind of the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, and that's kind of the war that defined classical Greece and also marked the end of it and kind of weakened it enough for the conquest of the Macedonians and the Romans later on. Yeah, I think that's it. And I think we can shoot it back to you, Dr. Rob.
All right, everybody. That's all we got for this week. Have a wonderful weekend. Start thinking about what your format for your final project is going to be, and we will pick it up with Roman mythology on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.